Oh,
Yeah, it's
recording
recording.
us?
Like
It's
It's all
recorded.
good.
Okay.
I can't
Yeah,
remember.
don't be nervous. You guys are
I'm
gonna do
chilling,
well.
bro.
Oh, they're
Yeah,
they're chilling.
we keep in
Yeah.
touch though.
I love them.
Okay.
I got
Hmm?
coffee in me
I
now,
love
so I'm good.
the whole atmosphere.
Okay. All right. So today, hi everyone. My name's Ryan. Kenny already introduced himself. Today we're going to be going over a rundown of whiteboarding technical interviews. So let's get started. All right. Like I said, my name's Ryan. The email sent out said that I'm going to be a software engineer at Walmart, but I'm not. Kenny will be. I'm going to be a software engineer at a local startup in Brea called Ardius, a tax R&D startup.
Yeah. Shout
And
out though. Ryan did get an offer for Walmart.
yeah,
He just didn't like the location.
yeah, I got an offer for um, the location in Bentonville, Arkansas, and I wasn't about the Arkansas life. So,
Yeah.
so,
We all feel it.
so,
100%.
yeah. And now Kenny can go ahead and introduce
My
himself.
name's Kenny. I'm going to be an incoming software engineer for Walmart Labs, based out of DC. One big thing that I want to let everyone know is that, like, for me, I actually didn't have any internships this hiring season. So, like, I was able to get a couple job offers without it. And that was actually one of the biggest things because of Leetcode grind and like interview prep and side projects, as my internship was actually canceled last year because of COVID. So, like, if I was able to get a job, you guys should be able to as well if you put in like the time.
If you grind as hard as Kenny, you guys can make it too.
So for your typical interview process, you first apply to a job or get like a referral, and you next typically receive an online assessment. And this is actually the portion where it's going to test your Leetcode skills. So your online assessments are typically on the platforms like HackerRank, CodeSignal, and other platforms. Some platforms are actually a bit more rigorous than others. For example, with CodeSignal, they give you 4 problems to do within like a 90-minute or 70-minute window, depending on the company who's interviewing you, like Robinhood. And the biggest issue with an assessment like this is they actually not only time you on your ability to solve the algorithm, but they time how long you spend on the algorithm itself. So, for example, there'll be 4 questions, and they'll time how long you spent on the 4th question. And when you actually submit it, they'll actually time your time complexity, like how fast your algorithm runs. And this actually determines your score. For example, I think the max is 850. My personal best and highest was an 840 out of 850. And at times with online assessments, they're basically a way to weed out candidates before actually getting to a real interview. And you typically have to try to score the highest here, as for example, if you don't really have internships, you typically need to get like a near perfect score to even go to the next round. In the case of Robinhood, actually this last hiring season, I got an 840 out of 850, which is near perfect, and I actually didn't get an interview after that. So they can be a bit tough at times. And after an online assessment, you typically might get a recruiter screen. And this is where they kind of get a feel for your personality and ask you like behavioral interview questions like, hey, tell me about a time you had a conflict with another team member. But depending on the company itself, you might do a recruiter screen first or an online assessment. Or at times you might not even have an online assessment if you have a referral. And typically after that is when you get a phone screen technical. So you'll be usually like doing an hour-long interview with a software engineer, and they might ask you some behavioral questions, and then ask you 1 or 2 Leetcode questions to really see if you will go on to the onsite. And the onsite is typically where you make it or break it. In this, you'll have multiple different rounds. You might have 1 or 2 rounds with a manager or just some sort of software engineer that will test you on your behavioral skills. And it really depends on where you are and what company you're applying to. Some companies have more rounds than others. And for example, an intern interview process may not be as rigorous compared to a new grad. And typically here, you might get 1, 2, or 3 rounds of Leetcode-esque problems. So they'll ask you algorithm questions you need to solve. And depending on the company itself, these problems will vary in range of difficulty. For example, like typically like Google or those type of companies like Fangs are very notorious at having hard problems. For example, TikTok over this last hiring season was really brutal, and the same for Roblox. And depending if you are a new grad, if the company may also ask you a system design round as well. But typically Leetcode and HackRank isn't the platforms where you usually practice this. And after this, you may have another interview if they're really on the fence about you, or you might get an offer. But one of the things I like to focus here is that the hiring season starts in August and typically wraps out at the end of fall for these large tech companies. Like, for example, over the last hiring season, I think around October, my mentor at Microsoft was told by his friend who is in HR that they received 3 times the applicants by October than they did the entire hiring process last year. So it can be fairly competitive.
Just a couple of things that Kenny didn't go as in depth for. When it's a technical phone screen, usually they'll focus on more like array-based questions and not as much questions you could not do on a whiteboard that don't require drawings. So when you get a phone screen, they usually won't ask you things about graphs or trees, but they'll focus on like everything else, and they could range, like Kenny said, in difficulty. Like
Yeah.
it'd be really simple, like just basic explanation, or they could be something that is pretty hard. And sometimes the phone screen will be just directly actually just on a phone, or sometimes they'll shoot you a Google Doc link or some sort of like code pad, and then like you're on the phone, and then like you do something with like while you're on the phone with them.
Yeah, the phone screen technical is really variable. Depending on the company, you might see graph problems if they are a higher one, like maybe Snap, for example. But it really just depends on how techie-ish your company is.
Yeah.
So one of the, if you haven't really done Leetcode or any of this kind of like algorithm grind, you should choose a language that you're really familiar with. And most companies will let you use the language you're the most familiar with. But for example, if you use Scala, you might not always get the option on online assessments or in interviews. So really, you really have to choose a language that caters towards more of your area or expertise. For example, if you're doing mobile app development, you might want to do like Objective-C or something of that nature. But for example, like I took a BlackRock online assessment this last fall, and they only allowed Java, C, and Python. So Java, C, Python are really good options, but if you're more into web development, JavaScript can be an option as well. But the biggest thing is that you should choose a language you are familiar with, or something that you know you can become familiar with, because you don't want to hop between languages between interviews. You just want to choose something that's common enough that most companies will allow you to interview in. See, personally for me, I actually do Java, but I know a lot of friends who do C++ or Python as well. And I don't know if you guys know this, but C++ is actually really popular in the competitive programming community. So typically those like top 1% of like algorithm solvers would use C++ as well.
There.
You want to do this one, Dimitri?
Yeah, I could. So for like Kenny saying, once you know and like have mastered all those things, you really want to like learn how all of like the data structures are implemented in those languages. You want to like know how to implement different popular data structures all from scratch in that language. You want to know how. Pay attention if you haven't already taken 2400 when they're going over like how to implement a linked list. Like make sure you know like, oh, you create objects with like that represent a node, and then you have the pointers that like represent like the chain of the linked list and all of that stuff. You got to make sure that you have all of these, because these are all the bases for the questions that they're going to be asking you. They're going to be asking you questions that are based off of these data structures, or that are built upon how you would use these specific data structures, like which data structures are most applicable to specific questions. Like for social media companies, big companies like Facebook and such, they rely a lot on trees and graphs, and they will ask questions like that would like require graphs, different graph traversal algorithms and stuff like that.
Yeah. So with data structures, if you don't really know where to start, one of the things I do personally recommend is maybe implementing them from scratch to really get a feel for how these data structures work. And one of the big things you actually also need to know is the time complexities of the operations of these methods. For example, in Java with an array, if you have an array of like 50 objects or something of that nature, and you want to see if it contains an integer, arrays.contains is actually a big O of n operation. So you kind of have to understand these things. Like in a heap, if you want to insert a node, it'd be like log n. If you want to access it, it's a constant O of n. You have to know all these time complexities for these data structures, because later on when you formulate your like answer, you would actually have to give the time complexity of your whole program. And you can't really overlook these simple operations, because when you run, like for example, an online assessment, when you run your code, they'll have a wide variety of test cases, and odds are there will be one that'll be a fairly large case. And if your runtime does not meet a certain threshold, you will get that wrong.
Yep.
Yeah. So next, you also have to know your algorithms. I'd start with the basic sorting fundamentals. There are different sorts like quick sort, merge sort, bucket sort, heap sort, and insertion sort. You don't need to know them all directly, but you should understand how they work and know their average, best, and worst time cases, as some are better than others in certain situations. As at times I've actually had in a phone interview, they had me implement quicksort from scratch. So you can be quizzed on this, because this is a part of the homework you should be able to know prior. So there are a lot of sorting fundamentals you need to know. And for example here, like if you look at this GIF, you can see that they all work very differently, but you really need to know your algorithms. As for example, quicksort could be applied to an algorithm question in different ways that you never really expected.
Yeah, but just like Kenny was saying, even if they don't directly ask you a question about the sorting algorithm, their ideas behind these can easily be applied to different solutions for different kinds of problems, because they all deal with very large data sets and such.
So there are more algorithms you need to know. So these are the very common ones that you actually most likely use, which is depth first search and breadth first search. You can really use them on many things, especially trees and graphs. Though depending on the company, you'll actually run into something called dynamic programming. And there's different approaches you can take. I believe most people take a top-down approach. I personally enjoy doing a bottom-up. And you'll usually see these questions at more of the higher-tiered companies for tech, as they are a bit more difficult. And next are also greedy algorithms, which can be seen with the coin trick or the coin GIF down there, where the idea is you're always trying to take the best thing for your current state. And then the ones that aren't used as much, but they can come up, which are backtracking, Dijkstra's, topological sort, and divide and conquer. And the biggest thing I'd like to emphasize here with algorithms is, in an interview or online assessment, there are a wide range of problems you can be asked about. So you shouldn't sleep on any of these. Even though, for example, Dijkstra's would not most likely come up as often as depth first search or breadth first search, you should still have an understanding of those algorithms, as you don't want a curveball at all.
Yeah, so it was like what Kenny was saying. You want to make sure you understand all of them at least just a little bit, and to practice them, to make sure that they're in your pocket and that you remember like all of these things. And it may seem like there's a lot, but it's important to like take them step by step. Just go like and build upon which ones, like go with the easier ones, and then say like, okay, I understand these traversal algorithms, and I could get onto this next traversal algorithm and understand how this one works better because I practiced this one, and make sure that you know them before a bunch of interviews. And then alongside all of that, you're going to want to know the time complexity. We've been mentioning this throughout the presentation. You're saying like, oh, you should know the time complexity of this thing. You want to know your big O notation, because whenever you write a program, they are going to ask you, okay, like how long is that going to take you? Like Kenny said on different OAs, if you have a program that is too slow for a specific input size, you won't even pass that specific algorithm, even though that code that you wrote does solve that problem that they gave you. If it takes too long, it's not a valuable solution or a correct solution in their eyes. So you have to be able to understand what big O notation is, what the time complexity, how long your program will run, and how much lower it'll get the bigger your input size is. And alongside just time complexity, you want to know memory and how much memory your program is going to take up. Like, so if you have a recursive algorithm, you have to understand that that's going to take up more memory on the stack than just an iterative algorithm. Or if you have if you're doing something specifically manipulating a data input size where it has to like duplicate pieces that, like, oh, I have to duplicate this data, so it's going to take up way more memory, this implementation versus like another implementation that you're doing. So you always want to try to keep both of these things as low as possible. Sometimes you can't get beyond just like O of n for some problems. And so you just want to try to get as low as possible. It doesn't have to be like always the best, because some problems only have higher complexity solutions, but you always want to just try to find the best one that you can.
Yep. For example, like I've done in an interview something called a prefix sum. So I had to create a matrix containing all those sums, and then I had to run binary search on it. And the time complexity for that is n log n. And you have to calculate and demonstrate you have the abilities to know the time complexity and the space as well. So for example, here, we have an example of calculating time complexity. So what I personally typically do is split the algorithm into operations, then calculate the big O of each operation, and then in a sense, take out the constants and combine them together. For example, if you had this program that had a nested for loop and a for loop, that nested for loop is going to iterate n times, and within n times, every n operation is going to iterate m times. So that's going to give you a big O of m times n. Whereas the loop under that only iterates n times, which gives you a big O of n. And you see how n right here is a variable that typically is going to be your input size, and that can vary as, for example, a test case could be like 10 or could be 1,000. And to find the big O of this, we combine them at the end, which is m times n plus n, but we take the biggest constants, which is m times n, as the additional n is actually pretty negligible.
Because the growth factor is bounded by the bigger one. You always just want to assume, well, this is going to be the worst thing. This is what's messing up the speed, because this n is not really affecting the overall runtime. So you just want to always pick the biggest one.
So with Leetcode, this is going to feel overwhelming at first, but there are many types of problems seen, which is why we emphasize to start early. So typically you should know DFS, BFS. You should know how to work with arrays and string manipulations, especially in your languages. As for example, in Java, you cannot actually manipulate a string directly. Typically, you might have to make a new string as a whole, but a programming language like Python might let you actually manipulate it. And you have to know graphs and trees. Trees more of an emphasis I put on, but if you want to go to a top tech company like Google or Facebook, I wouldn't even doubt if you got graphs and trees in the same interview process. As for graphs, there's also directed and undirected, and you kind of need to know the difference and how to work with them. Next, there's a sliding window or 2 pointers. There are actually really common questions like this, like trapping rainwater, which on Leetcode, they say it's a hard, but nowadays they're actually more of a medium because of how popular they are. And you should know greedy algorithms as well. And then there's some that are sometimes just based off of data structures, like manipulating linked lists and doing, type of problem. I will answer that in a moment. But there's also binary search. If you guys ever done that, it can get pretty complex with that, and it can be applicable to problems that you really wouldn't think there are. And there's dynamic programming, bit masking, which is like more like bit manipulations, and backtracking, recursion. There's one that are straight up math related. Like my TikTok 08 had a question that was based off a mathematical formula. There's also design questions that are more like object-oriented design, like LRU cache, or designing data structures. And for me, what type of problems scare me the most? I think my biggest area is probably dynamic programming, as at times it can get really complicated pretty quick. And for example, I've had a question where I've actually had to create a 2D matrix, I think, using dynamic programming, and then had to run binary search on that as well. And then I've had times where I have to do prefix sum and binary search on that. So it can get really complicated depending on what problem I get. And most of the time that's based out of luck or how an interviewer is feeling. Because they could give you like an easy or medium, or they can really hate you, or they have to give you a hard. Like over the TikTok interview process, one of my friends actually ended up getting out of 3 rounds, he got 2 hards. And in one of those rounds, on top of doing a hard, he had to do a medium as well. So it's pretty random at times.
Yeah, I'd say dynamic programming is hard. Coming up with the little base cases for the building up stuff, like
Yeah.
having is difficult sometimes. Like it's hard. It's hard to just go like, okay, I need to build it up this way with my like DP array or whatever.
Yeah.
So,
and the question with Sean, I see. What year are you, Sean? If you don't mind putting that in the chat. First year. Honestly, I would start with the race. It's good to start early. I'm pretty sure next hiring season, so beginning around August, you can actually do like Microsoft Explorer program or like Google Step. They'll most likely ask you easies and possibly a medium. So if I were you, I would do more DFS, BFS, maybe learn what those are, maybe arrays and strings, and maybe learn trees.
Linked lists. They like
linked lists
a lot
as
of
well,
linked
data
list
structures.
problems.
But you most likely won't see something like dynamic programming because we're actually
no.
taught that in CS 3310, which is like a junior level course.
Yeah.
So you shouldn't be encountering that yet.
Yeah. So you're ahead of the game. Starting now is good.
Problem is, if you're taking 2400, that's good.
Pay attention with your linked lists and everything. When I interviewed at Google for their like step program thing, I didn't get it because I hadn't taken 2400 yet, and they asked me a linked list question. So they like linked lists and arrays a lot of the time. I've seen their practice problems and stuff that they're usually that. So like work yourself up. That's a good place to start.
Yeah. Oh, that's a fat league.
Yeah.
No,
totally. Just do it in your free time right now, because like if you start it now, it'll become habit and easier, and you don't have to grind as much because you just know it, and it won't.
And the biggest thing is like, it's like the biggest thing is like building up your intuition. Like for me, I haven't really grinded Leetcode for like a couple months since I've gotten my offers, but from time to time, I actually do the Leetcode competitions at the end of the week when they introduce new problems. Or I might just look at a problem and try to formulate an answer in my head and just check suggestions to see if my approach is correct. And like things like this, you may start forgetting a bit of it, but after hiring season, it's not like it's going to completely go away. You just might have to relearn a couple things. But since you're starting early, that's a really good thing because you want to start early because you can't really cram this into a week. You can attempt to, but most likely that information won't really stick in your head. What do you mean by Leetcode hard, easy, etc.? So they give it a classification of how intense a program is. Leetcode easy is maybe like you've taken 1400 in data structures. You should be at least able to do this. Leetcode medium is you put in a bit more time. You might have to use multiple data structures within that problem and maybe apply like, I don't know, DFS and then do something else afterwards. And hard is typically like you're combining 2 medium problems. Typically, you'd see multiple data structures in here and you use more algorithms. So like, for example, I've done a prefix sum. And after I did a prefix sum on matrix, I now have to apply my knowledge of binary search on it. Yeah, even with only, even with I had CS14, I could do questions.
Cool.
Honestly, we can talk about that later, because we have a thing of our whole experience to remind me on that.
I think that's the next slide.
We go to the next. No, so how to we're going to talk about how to approach a whiteboard now. So typically when you go on a whiteboard, you just don't want to go in and start solving the question. They're going to usually give you the question and they won't really give you much with it. They'll just be like, hey, reverse a linked list. But what I personally like to do is first think of questions I should ask. How should my input look like? How should my output look like? What are the edge cases? For example, if you give me a tree node that has that's null or has children that's null, what do I do? Or if you have an array, what do I do if the array is size 0? And for example, if I have an array of integers, are there any negative integers? Are there duplicates? Are they only positive? You want to think of things of that nature. So when you program down the line, you come up with the formula, like you formulate your answer based on that information. So like after you get all that clarification, now you use your previous knowledge to try to make an answer. So look for clues and approaches, and this is where your intuition comes in from doing these problems. Like, oh, I've seen that typically this situation calls for a heap, or this situation calls for BFS. And you really want to look for clues that may guide you towards certain algorithms or data structures. But I can't emphasize this enough. You want to make sure you're vocal about this throughout your whole process, because your interviewer may dislike your approach and guide you towards an optimal solution.
And like when Kenny's saying all this stuff, like ask what the array sizes are and like what the input inside those arrays are, it's really important to ask these too, because a lot of the times if these are hints to how to solve the problem, like it'll be a very specific kind of input, like, oh, we're only giving you positive integers, then like that helps you figure out a solution, like, oh, they're all positive, so I can like iterate and do this thing with the array and that'll help me find it quicker. Or they're all there's no duplicates, so that means I know each one's unique and I could like do this solution with it. So you want to ask all these questions because these questions will then help you get the better solution. And usually they won't give it to you because they want you to ask them, even though like it's important to solve the question. And
next, after you have all that information and you begin to like brainstorm your ideas, don't actually just start coding. What I personally do is I ask the interviewer and say like, hey, do you want me, like, is my approach all right? Like, I want to ensure that they won't down the line say, oh, this is completely wrong. You want to make sure that they're fine with it, and also give them the time complexity and space complexity of your algorithm as well. Because for example, you might have an a big O of n squared algorithm that they actually don't want because the optimal could be O of n instead. And if you just like went on with the n squared without asking them, you pretty much failed around. Mm-hmm. And after they do finally approve, one of the big things I can emphasize more is comment your code. And what I mean by that is maybe at the beginning, type out your approach, and while you're actually writing your algorithm, if it becomes kind of obscure, comment it out. And the reason for this is down the line, when they're making a hiring decision, the interviewer might look back and look at your code, because they, when they're interviewing, they might go through 4, 5, 6, or even more people in a day. So they might directly not remember your approach. And one of the big things is with interview rounds, other interviewers might look at how you did in other rounds as well. They'd want to look over like, oh, what kind of approach did you do? You did well in mine, but did you do well in others? Or they might be on the fence with you, so they'll look at your other rounds instead. And after you're actually done writing, quote unquote, your code, you should also do a logic check and check for syntax. And one of the big reasons why is if they actually do have an IDE for you to run it, you don't want to spam that button. Like, you don't want to keep on running, submitting, because that's going to look really poorly. And once you actually believe now your logic and code like is correct, you either now run it if they let you, like if there's an IDE, or if you're on something like Google Docs, you run through the logic with test cases. And I've had at times like one of my interviewers put in a lot of test cases for a company called Qualtrics, because I ended up getting a problem called decode ways that I did like a week or two prior, and given a 40-minute window to do it, I ended up doing it in 10, and he was kind of shocked. So he tried to break it nonstop for 10 minutes, but wasn't able to. And after that, you finished your problem, congrats. Depending on the situation, that might give you an extension to that problem and give you a new test case, like, hey, what happens now if the input is something else? Or or depending on the company and how much time you have left, you might get another question, or that's the end of your round.
Okay. So,
do you want to start your own experiences, Dimitri?
Sure. Yeah. So me and Kenny applied to most of the same places and did a lot of the like same OAs. And like I applied to like Google and got interviewed for, oh shoot, I activated my Google Home, my bad. I applied and like did their like step internship application before, and like went through and did that. And I applied to Walmart with Kenny. We could probably both talk about that one in a little bit.
Okay, turning on the living room.
Oh shoot, it turned on my TV.
That's hilarious.
It's
That's
funny.
hilarious.
That's funny. All right. It's on now in the background. Sorry about that. And I applied to a lot of
Sorry, it looks like those lights
oh
haven't
my
been set up
gosh.
yet. You can do
1 second. Uh,
Here, I'll go. Just
unplug
just
it.
go fix it.
That's all right.
Just go
Sorry
fix it.
about that.
Got it. Turning off the living room TV.
Okay, now unplug that thing. My bad. So like we applied to this company up in the Bay Area called Viva, and like depending on like the different companies, they'll have different orders and how they're applied to, like you apply to them. Some like Viva had the that one we actually didn't have an OA for, because that one they did the behavioral first. We got on the phone, we talked with the person, like said, oh, like what are we interested in? Like, oh, why do we want to do this? And like sometimes you gotta just be as nice as possible, and sometimes you just don't click with the interviewer, which is a pain in the butt, because this like when I think me and Kenny had the same interviewer too for Viva, and she was just she seemed so uninterested, I guess the entire time. Like we're all like trying, like, oh yeah, like we're all trying to be all hype and everything in our interview, and then she was just really uninterested, and it's like, okay, cool, we'll get back to you. And then like a couple days later you just get the email,
Get
it's
a
like,
fat reject and like,
like,
okay,
it's
I
like
expected
sorry,
that.
like yeah, it's like yeah, I expected that. It's like, oh, sorry, you didn't like fit in or whatever, or like, well, we picked a different candidate to move forward with or something. And then you just go, okay, and then that's why you have to apply to a bunch. I didn't apply to as many as Kenny, but Kenny like applied to like 80 something or more.
I
Right?
did like 200 apps last
Really?
season. Yeah, bro.
Yeah, he applied to like a ridiculous amount of companies, and like they're all different with how they do things.
Yeah.
Like
so
but they all follow that same structure that we had, where it's like some will give you the OA. A lot of them give the OAs first just to weed out candidates, or like, or they'll do the phone interview, but they all like usually have some parts of those pieces that we mentioned earlier.
So like one of the biggest things is like I want to emphasize is that rejections do happen. They do suck, but you kind of just got to plow through them. Like for example, the company right here called Pendo, that's actually a unicorn based out of Triangle Park. And I basically went through the whole interview process, but didn't get an offer just because the other candidate had an internship and mine was canceled. And when I mean I went through the whole interview process, it was a recruiter screen, then online assessment, then engineering, a meeting with an engineering manager, then a phone technical, then the onsite, which was four interviews on top of that. Then I had the CTO screen. And then after that, it turns out the team that I would have been on took another person because they had an internship experience and I didn't. And I think also I really like want to emphasize that at times things are out of your own hands. For example, with my Qualtrics interview, I smashed that interview, but ended up getting rejected a few days later. And when I connected with my interviewer, because he was like really nice, he told me he was shocked because he said he gave me perfect marks since I was able to basically give an answer pretty quickly and give out my ideas. But he just said at the end of the day, it's the hiring manager's decision and it's completely out of your choice. And you could just hope for the best. And I see Sean right here. How do you cope with them if you get nothing but rejects? That takes off. I mean, yeah, like what New said
tough.
is like
but,
tough. Like,
but it's
you just suck it up and you go to next.
You'll get what you need, is my opinion. Like the company that you need at whatever like point in your life you are, like there's a ton of them, they're practice, and eventually you will get something, and that'll be what you need in life at that moment. It might not be what you want, like you might not get your Fang or whatever, like get into Facebook first try, but you'll get into what you need basically.
Oh, do you write a cover letter? I never write cover letters. And
they take too long. And they don't read them.
Most likely,
a lot of recruiters, they won't read them. Like if you connect with recruiters on LinkedIn and stuff, they say, we don't read them. Like it's so important to write cover letters with like sometimes you could maybe like research startups or
research
like research the company, and like you can see recruiters and stuff on like LinkedIn. Like so everyone should have a LinkedIn. That's important to have. On LinkedIn, you'll see like, oh, we read our cover letters. So then you see that, then like you should write a cover letter, try to tailor it to make yourself like, it's a good first impression, and it'll help you like get in with them. But if it's like a big company like TikTok or something, don't bother. It's a waste of your time.
And one of the big things I want to emphasize that your experience may not always be the same as someone else's.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest thing is that there are so many, for example, with your technicals, there's such a wide range of varieties of questions you can be asked. Some people get lucky and they only get asked easies and a medium. For example, with Amazon, that happened to my friend. He got easies and mediums, while my other friend only got mediums and hards. And it's for the same interview, it's for the same position, and they both all had the 3 rounds, but it's just both RNG. Like, you can't really do anything past a certain point. And really as well, like, depending on the company, your experience may also kind of like differ a bit. For example, like I know some people who did JP Morgan like me, and they actually failed like some of their algorithm questions, but still got an offer. And that's one really big thing I want to emphasize earlier is that you really need, when you're doing a whiteboard interview, you really need to think out loud, because directly, maybe your code ideally works logically, but just didn't get to run. That if you really said like your whole thought process, you might not get a strong hire. You most definitely probably would not get a strong hire, but instead of being a no, you might get more of an indecisive or possibly a hire if the person likes you. But that typically is based on your own experience. You typically do want to be able to solve and have it run though, because that's in that gray area where you probably won't get an offer if you have multiple rounds like that.
Yeah.
And for Sean, it's literal RNG. Yeah. All you can really do is try your best. Yeah. You want to prepare as much as you can, but at the end of the day, you shouldn't value your self-worth based on your ability to get into a specific company.
Yeah.
Like
if you do that, you're going to be sad.
Yeah. Like in my opinion, like that's kind of like that toxic Fang community where people say you only have to get into Fang. You don't always have to. Like there's that 1% of people who will always be getting multiple offers, and I wouldn't compare yourself with them. Just compare yourself to yourself and just try to improve on that.
Mm-hmm.
And
everybody's a different mindset kind of thing too. Yeah. So it's like some people have that mindset for Fang, other people's don't. You might not be a match for that kind of community. And there's companies big and small that you could apply to. They're all follow like the same kind of thing. Like with the cover letters and stuff, smaller companies usually care more about that.
And like for example, Sean, okay. Like you don't want to go into Fang. It's really up to you. That's a personal choice. Most people don't end up at Fang. Let's be honest. And most people who want to go don't always realize how much of a grind it is, and they kind of give up. And Amazon, actually talking about Amazon, for new grad, the Amazon process is typically an online assessment, and you typically have to pass them very well. Depending how you do on the online assessment, you either get a one round 45-minute interview or half an hour interview going over your Leetcode questions, or you might get a 3-rounder, which is I think 3 rounds of 50 minutes where you're asked algorithm questions. On the 3-rounder, you typically need at least 2 out of 3 to get an offer, or 3 out of 3 hopefully. And there's typically a bar raiser where it's to a point where like even if you get 1 out of 3 for a round and you got that one bar raiser, you won't get an offer, because for something like that, since there's not too many rounds, you need to pass all of them. And what the biggest thing is, like, if you start early, you can kind of get a feel of how these companies are. The biggest, I mean, it kind of can be, Sean, but really, it's really up to you. Like, you kind of reap what you sow. So the more effort you put in, hopefully your job prospects are going to be better. And like, there's the top 1%. They'll get like 3 Fang interviews and they'll get all the offers and be like, oh, I'm at Facebook this spring, and then Microsoft this summer, and then Citadel this fall. Like, there's always going to be that 1%, but I wouldn't compare yourself to others. Yeah. I compare yourself to yourself and see how well you can improve. Like, hey, a year ago, I couldn't do an easy Leetcode problem, and now I can do them in 15 minutes.
Don't compare yourself to LinkedIn posts.
Sure.
Don't compare yourself to those people who are like, I'm taking this internship in the spring and this one in the fall, and I'm gonna work at Google in a year. They already offered me a job. Like, don't. It's okay. Work on yourself. And
I mean, the biggest thing, Sean, is that it's not good for your mental health, in my opinion. it's
Yeah.
good to say like, hey, how did you do it, XYZ? I want to follow in your footsteps. But putting yourself in a place where it's like, hey, I need to be doing like, I need to
Yeah.
get Fang offers. I need to do all this. You should ask yourself, why do you want it? What was the process like to secure those internships? Typically, they're a bit easier than new grad. Depending on them, you'll get like a behavioral interview and a couple technicals. But with internships, they really want to see that you're willing to learn and you've done side projects on your own outside of school to show that like, hey, you've learned a lot. Like for example, for me, I do a lot of botting. So like I'll do like sneaker bots and I'll write applications to get shoes, or I'll do like in-game automation to make money for games like RuneScape, and really showed how I, in a sense, learned things out of school. And I was doing my own side projects and I was willing to learn on the job as well.
Yeah, they just want to see that you like coding, really. So like
Yeah.
you could do side projects, like just make dumb websites or whatever, like throw stuff
They just
together,
want to see you
and
try.
they're seeing that you're like learning, and like they don't
Yeah.
have to like be big or huge or anything. They just have to be like you're doing stuff, and like it shows that you're interested and that you
Yeah.
enjoy learning, because
Like-
the internship experience, is like
No, you're good.
completely is just learning. Basically, you're learning the
Yeah.
entire time you're on the job. You're like, so they want to see that you are up to learning and that you enjoy learning. So,
Yep. And it's like, for example, right now my resume is all just side projects since my internships were canceled. But I was still able to secure jobs by doing really well in the technicals and showing how like I've learned even though my internships were canceled, and how I kind of got over like, hey, blah, blah, blah. I literally got a phone call 2 weeks before my summer internship saying it was canceled. And instead of sulking the whole summer, I decided to learn React and front-end development. Yeah. Do you want to go to the next slide, Dimitri? We don't have much time left.
True. Yeah.
So with the tips, with Leetcode, a way I kind of approach it is you try to solve a problems, and if you can't do it after 20 or 30 minutes, there's not really too much hope. I look at the discussion section where people who have already done it and see how they completed it and their thought process. But one big thing is that when you do Leetcode, you want to do some sort of plan. You just don't want to go on and just start doing random problems. For me, if I do Leetcode, I want to do like an area. Like today, I'm going to focus on dynamic programming. So I might do a handful of those. And a couple of days later, I might come back and try them again to see if I really beefed up my intuition and learned anything from them. And furthermore, you should really try to time yourself, because whiteboard interviews are timed and you won't get a lot of time. You could have a 60-minute session, and within that 60-minute session, the first 10 minutes is behavioral, and the last 50 could be 2 algorithm problems that you have to complete. So you really have to try to, in a sense, cut down on your time and get to a point where you can do like Leetcode mediums in 15, 20 minutes. And then also do not rely on the run button on Leetcode. There's a run and submit button. You shouldn't spam that, because in a real interview, you can't spam that, or you shouldn't, because that looks really bad. And one thing we want to emphasize is like we showed you all these data structures and algorithms. It is a lot, but you want to start early and start incrementally. So like, for example, if you want to start hiring or interviewing, you might start 3 months before an interview and ramp it up over time. And with that, you should also try practicing with friends. There are platforms like binarysearch.com or binarysearch.com where you could actually do Leetcode with your friends and do it in competition, like whoever can complete this question within 20 minutes wins first, second, third, etc. And lastly, there's a guy. Okay, this one's more of an opinionated one. There's a guy called Nick White on YouTube. Never watch him, in my opinion. You're gonna waste your time. He's really terrible at explaining Leetcode problems. Yeah. Like terrible. Like you're gonna waste your time, believe me.
Yeah, he's not very good, and yeah, just don't waste your
just don't waste your time.
And he's very condescending, and he'll make you feel bad.
Yeah,
like what Sean was saying, like, oh, like you're comparing yourself to other people, because he'll be like, oh, this one's like super easy, but then like you'll see him run it and submit it and see that he failed it a bunch of times before actually being able to like do it. So it's okay.
Yeah. Right, do you want to go next 13 minutes, bro? Okay. So here's like a mini timeline. You really want to start over time, like we said, and you want to start with the basics of a language, then familiarize with the data structures and algorithms to really get a feel, and then start Leetcode. And after that, you want to incrementally increase the difficulty. Say, I'm getting pretty okay at easies now. I'm going to try doing mediums. I'm getting better at mediums. I'm going to try hards. And once you're comfortable, one thing I can't emphasize enough are doing mock interviews with others, like with your friends or people on Pramp or things of that nature, because Leetcode is just, Leetcode isn't directly enough for whiteboarding because you're not always directly saying or thinking out loud and coding and typing or coding and speaking at the same time. So you want to get that practice in. And a few weeks before your interview, you should learn about a company, their culture, and maybe even what kind of sort of algorithm questions they ask. There's things like Leetcode Premium that some people pay to look at like problem pools for specific companies, but they can be very large still. Like for example, like Amazon has a couple hundred problem pool on Leetcode that they've asked, like every single question there they've asked before. Hence why like we like to emphasize not to memorize just a specific question, but instead build up your intuition because there are a wide variety of questions you can be asked. Yeah, actually we got that in the resources. I do recommend a couple people because they're really good. Back-to-back suites, yep. So the key takeaways?
Yeah, back-to-back suite is good, yeah.
Just emphasize, just start and be prepared, as it is a grind to build up your intuition, and don't cram, don't memorize specific things. And one thing I've been asked is how many problems you need to solve to get a job. It's not directly how many you need to solve, it's how well you want to improve and how well like you, it's more of a person by person basis of how many questions it's needed for them to build up that intuition to a certain point. And for example, for me, I've done a couple hundred Leetcode problems, and I could do like a medium now in 15 minutes, and I could do a hard in like half an hour or even shorter at times. But it just really depends on how well you want to do it. Remember to speak out your thoughts in a whiteboard interview process. You don't want to be awkward and just code the whole time and just say, I'm done. Like they want to see how they want to pick your brain. They want to see how you formulate your logic, how you actually type it out, what you're thinking. It's all very important. And also do not sleep on behavioral interviews because you can be technically adept, be one of the best, but if you can't actually communicate, they're really not gonna like that and probably won't hire you, because one of the big things with software engineering is you should be able to communicate with others. Yeah. Because you are building something from scratch with multiple people. And if you can't communicate, that's kind of like a bottleneck.
Programming is a team exercise, basically. Yeah. So they want to make sure that you could work well on a team. And also another one that we didn't like bullet point here, but a good one like that we talked about, that just don't stress too much. Do this a long time and don't compare yourself to others. Yeah. Because that's just a bad time. I did it. It's not fun. So don't do it.
Yeah. So you want to go to resources? Oh,
and then yeah.
Here, there's some random stuff. For me, if you're gonna watch YouTube for Leetcode, I would watch Kevin Nottington because he goes over like the type of question a bit more in depth. It's not always the best because he's kind of big brain at times, and it's like, how did you make that like assumption?
He'll make
and
big,
like, you have to
big
really
leaps.
think about it. Yeah. But there's a guy called Back-to-Back Sui. I think he's a Twitter employee, or he interned at Twitter or something of that nature. Mm-hmm. He actually explains concepts very well. For example, like backtracking, he'd start at the beginning and say, this is what you kind of need to think about, and then have videos of specific examples of that. And then there's other things like GitHub. For example, KDN251, that's actually Kevin Nottington's interview GitHub thing, and it's actually a list of different data structures, their time complexities, sorting algorithms as well, implementations. So there's a lot of resources online for you to help, like to kind of help you out on that. Yeah. Do you want me to share screens? We got like 9 minutes. Like I'll do like a simple problem of how I go over it personally. Oh.
I stopped sharing, so you should be able to share.
Yeah. All right, y'all can see my screen, right?
Yes, sir. We can see it.
Oh, that's not me. Boom. So, for example, this is how typically Leetcode looks like. When I do it, I ignore all of this. Just ignore that, and here's the reason why. In an interview, they're gonna just give you this. So, given an integer array and an integer k, return the kth element in the array. What I first do is, okay, I think of it. I type it down, so pretend I already typed it down. But I think to myself, what are the edge cases? How does my input supposed to look like? for example, in this case, I think of my input. Well, I know it's going to have, it's going to be an array. So it's going to look like something of this nature. And I'm going to get an integer k. You want to typically type this out in a whiteboard interview and give examples to make sure you have this input. So I might ask the interview, does this look correct? You know, like, hey, does this input look correct? If they say yes, okay, next I'm going to think, how's the output supposed to look like? Well, they want me to pass in an integer right here. So I know the output is going to be like 5 or something of that nature. And the next step is actually look at the edge cases. So here in Leetcode, they typically give you the constraints, but I want you to think about it yourself. Like, as the interview, what do I do if k is less than or equal to 0? How do I handle that case? Or for example, with the integer array nums, are there going to be duplicates? Are there going to be, are they all going to be positive? Are they going to be negative? What should I do in the situation where my array is actually empty? And given that, I know, okay, I have to cover cases 1, case 2, case 3 before I start coding. And now, given this, all this information, now I try to formulate my answer. Well, I know I want to look for the kth largest element in the array. Does anyone here have like a data structure in mind that they think they'd use? Like, how to look at chat? I want y'all to give me what data structure you guys would use in this situation, if anyone wants to. Does anyone have like an idea of what kind of data structure you would use? Okay, so I guess no one does. Q? Well, actually, personally, based off of my stack, not necessarily. See, since I know here that I want the kth largest, I'm actually thinking about more of a heap, because I know with a heap, there's either a min heap or a max heap. Yeah, and given whatever is, oh yeah, I mean you're 14 or 2400, you're starting it, so you're fine. So given a heap, I know that the top item is always going to be the min or the max. And given I know I want to use a heap, what I personally would do in this situation is actually use a heap and pop off k-1 entries by having a min heap. So then the top is whatever is left on top is actually the kth largest. And I communicate this with my interviewer and say like, hey, I'm going to iterate through all nums, which would take me n time. And given that, I'm going to add them onto the heap. And whatever is left at the top after k-1 pops is going to be my answer. The time complexity, well, I know I have to go through all the array, which would be n, and I'm using a heap as well. And I know for a heap, the insert and removal operations takes log n time. So I know that given n items from my nums, I could do at most log n for each item. So my time complexity would be n log n. And I'd be like, hey, this is my time complexity. And you remember, you want to say that you really want to write down the time complexity and things of this nature in case later on your interviewer looks back at it or another interviewer does. And I know for my space, at most in my heap, the worst case, I could have n items, or technically since I'm doing it in this way, I'd have k-1 items, but at some point all n items would go in. So I know my space complexity would be O of n. And now I ask my interview, hey, I'm going to use a heap and I'm going to do k-1 pops. At the end of the pops, I know the top item is going to be my answer. My time complexity would be n log n and my space would be O of n. Are you happy with that solution? May I begin? Did I either give you a yes or no? Say, hey, it can be a bit better, or no, it can, or like, hey, it can be a bit better, or sure, go ahead. And if they give you the go ahead, now you start typing. So I know, for example, next what I do is like, hey, I need to initialize a min heap. And in my language, that I would use the priority queue implementation. So give me a moment. Priority queue. Let's see. So in this, I'm creating my priority queue. I'm doing I'm using a lambda function to create it. And I'm doing it here. That is my priority. Boom. Now, given I have my priority queue here, next I'm going to iterate over XYZ. I know for Leetcode, I don't have to care about these constraints, but remember your edge cases. You want to handle your input prior to this in a real whiteboard interview to make sure you don't get anything bad, like that can go later on down here. So now once I have my priority count, now I know like, hey, next what am I going to do? Well, I need to iterate over my nums elements. So I'm going to communicate that with my interviewer and say right here, I'm iterating over nums plus. And now with my operations, what I'm basically going to do is add them into my heap and check, hey, if my heap is at its max capacity, I'm going to remove one and add one. So by the time I get down to the end of the array, I know the top of my min heap will be the kth largest item. So I'm going to offer num sub I. So I'm giving the heap, hey, do you have room for it or do you want it? If the size of the heap is larger than k, I want to remove an item. Cool. And then after this, I think that's actually it. And then pq.pull. So then logically with this, right, once I hit this point where I think my code is completed, I'd look over it, run through, are there any syntax errors? Are there any logistical mistakes? And at a point where I am now, where I now believe that I do have the correct answer, depending on if you're using a real IDE or not, you'd run a case or you'd run code or you'd run a test code by saying, hey, I have this input, would it work here? So in my case right here, it did run. So I'm gonna hit submit and see if it did work out, which I think it should because I've done this before, as you can see. So given that, on Leetcode, I'll tell you how fast it is. This is actually a good thing to note because depending on how fast it is, you kind of gauge to see how fast your time complexity solution should be. In a real interview, when you hit submit, now an interviewer might be happy with it, or you might be running through examples like this and saying, hey, I have a nums of 312464, and down the end, you might just be running through it, running through your algorithms, and that's how they might verify it. But one of the biggest things I like to emphasize is don't spam this button in a whiteboard interview. And with Leetcode, remember to basically ignore this. I want you to think of the things that would be there. What are the constraints? How should my input look like? How should my output look like? Because in a whiteboard interview, they might just give you a Google Doc and give you this. And that's why I say, like, don't just hop onto Leetcode and start doing questions. That's not enough. You're gonna actually kind of harm yourself because you're never given all this information and you really typically don't really communicate either. And we're kind of running out of time here, but I was going to show like, hey, this is an nlog n solution, but there's actually an O of n solution based off of quick sort. So given your different fundamentals, you can kind of try to formulate answers. For example, my mentor is a software engineer at Microsoft. He actually asked me one of his questions during a mock interview. He didn't want me to use a heap solution because this is like considered intuitive. He actually wanted me to use a quick select, which is a variation of quick sort solution, which was a reduced in time complexity. So depending on your interviewer, something you might think as intuitive may not actually be the correct answer. But yeah, I think that's it. Like Dimitri and I also got class like right now.
Nice presentation, Kenny, right there.
I think some of us, yeah, we do have class to get to, but yeah, thank you very much for coming out. I know this is like a very vital process, you know, obviously getting a job. So thank you for shedding some light on it. And to the rest of our members, good luck on your classes, and we'll catch you guys at the next meeting. See you guys.
All right, everyone.